Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. And I hope you enjoy this new show, whether you're viewing it on the internet or listening to a podcast version of the episode. I do want to thank you for being part of my audience. You can also find links to videos or podcasts on MiamiGhostChronicles.com, as well as where you can submit your story about any eerie experiences you've had, which I would love to hear about. Just go to the Submit Your Story tab. Please subscribe to our channel so that you receive notification of when we release a new show. And find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This is where I usually live stream and where I give you a behind-the-scenes look at locations where new episodes are being filmed at. I also tell you about all the interesting guests that will be appearing soon on Stories of the Supernatural. I hope you enjoy the show, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. And today I put a special show together about a house that's been around for quite a long time, but has recently made the news and everything because they came out with a movie about it, which is called Winchester, the movie. And the movie is based on the real life personality or character known as Sarah Winchester, who had a very famous, unusual house in San Jose, California. I visited the Winchester House about 2006, and I remember when I was taking the tour, I was thinking there was more of a purpose behind this lady's architecture, since she was directing all the building of the house, more than we were told. The story was always that Sarah Winchester went off to San Jose, bought this large piece of property, and just kept building and building. And she was a spiritualist, and she was basically building out of fear because she had been told by a spiritualist, a seer, that if she ever stopped building, she was going to die, and because almost like she was cursed because she was the heir of the Winchester rifle, which was also known as the rifle that won the West. She was very wealthy. But even since then, I knew that there was more to the story of Sarah Winchester. Now that the movie came out, I said this is a great time to do a little bit of investigating, based even, like I said, on my first-hand impression of when I visited the Winchester Mansion over 10 years ago. And even the few photos and slides that I'm going to include really do very little to capture how immense this structure is. Even though there were parts of it that were not open to the public, even then, it's hard to describe or envision not only the amount of space, but the detail. And you know that saying, the devil's in the detail? Well, it's in the details that we really get to know a little bit more about Sarah Winchester, or what we call the truth of Sarah Winchester. Let's start at the beginning. First of all, before she became Sarah Winchester, she was known as the Belle of New Haven. Her birth name was Sarah Lockwood Pardee, and she was the fifth of 7 children born to Leonard Pardee and Sarah Burns. There's, of course, because this was early 19th century, there was no existing records to establish her birth date. But it's guesstimated that it occurred sometime between 1835 to 1845. Now, it just so happens, and you'll see later on in the story, that her going out to California was not coincidental, because around 1849, when the California Gold Rush took place, a large number of her Pardee relatives left to that area of San Jose. Whether it was for the gold rush, they were pretty well off as they were there in Connecticut, New Haven. But the fact that she went out there in reality was because she went out there to be close to her Pardee relatives. So as I said, the time of her birth, her parents were a respectable upper middle class New Haven family, and her dad was a joiner, but he was a very shrewd businessman. And basically, because he was such a shrewd businessman, he went up the ladder of polite society as a successful carriage manufacturer. And then during the Civil War, he made a fortune supplying ambulances to the Union Army. Now, one of the things that come when your family has money is that you get a good education, which is apparently what Sarah's parents did. They consider her almost a child prodigy, and she was very beautiful. But she did. It's described that by the time she was 12 years old, she was already fluent in Latin, French, Spanish, and the Italian languages. She was very knowledgeable of the classics, Shakespeare, etc. She also was a very accomplished musician. And this is around that time that she became known in New Haven society as the Belle of New Haven. Now, like I said, she was educated. She had found her and her family had a place in respectable society. All right, and all of these things, of course, at that time there was another thing going on in New Haven, which is really interesting, was that it had become a hub of progressive, Freemasonic, Rosicrucian thinking and activity. And when she went, not only was she raised in this mindset, when she went to get educated, she was educated in an environment that espoused these philosophies. And several of her uncles and cousins were Freemasons. And at a very early age, she was admitted to Yale's only female scholastic institution, known as the Young Ladies Collegiate Institute. In there, one of the things that have to do a lot with the Freemasons is what they call baconian doctrine. And you're going to see how this plays on into, when you look at it, what's really a very methodical and precise form of why she built the Winchester House the way she did it. Contrary to what is basically the folklore, was that she was kind of like a cuckoo lady who was upset and very distraught over the death of her husband and her child, and that she ran off to escape the curse of the Winchester rifle empire by just building haphazardly. It seems that it's everything but that. She was very attracted to these type of, not only was she instructed, she really immersed herself in these type of Masonic philosophies. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that this Masonic, they were very preoccupied with secret encryption techniques using numbered cipher systems. And by this I mean, in other words, the secrets are there if you know what you're looking at. Think of the Da Vinci Code, as I'm giving an example of something that most people can relate to in modern times, where things are basically coded and you just have to have the eyes or the knowledge to decipher it. So she's brought up, she goes to even higher learning under this Masonic Rosicrucian, and she also learned not only the works, but she learned the rituals in the symbology. And along the way, she gravitated to Theosophy. As a matter of fact, most Rosicrucians are Theosophists. Now, she also adhered to Bacon's Kabbalistic Theosophy, that the universe's synergistic body is ever building. And by this, I'm trying to get you to see, this is what was she known for, which was building a house that was ever building. And as you can see, there's more to her motives for doing what she did with this house versus what's the popular idea is of what was motivating her. So Here she is. She's a young lady. She's growing up in New Haven. She's been schooled. She's articulate. Her family is very well positioned in society there. And she eventually marries a gentleman by the name of William Wirt Winchester, who was born in Baltimore. And he was the only son of Oliver Fisher Winchester and his wife Jane. Now, Oliver Winchester, along with his partner John Davies, they founded a successful clothing manufacturing company. And just based on that, he already had amassed a considerable fortune. Now, later on is when he put his efforts into firearms manufacturing around 1866 that evolved into the famous Winchester Repeating Arms Company. So this family was already wealthy even before they started producing the Winchester. According to the historical documents, both the Winchesters and the parties were already well acquainted. And because, first of all, they both attended the New Haven's First Baptist Church. And Sarah and William's sister Annie were classmates at the Young Ladies Collegiate Institute. So in other words, you could tell that when they decided to marry, this was a union probably encouraged and approved of by both sides of the family. Both sides of the family were well off. They were well known. They were integrated. So they married on September 30th, 1862. Now, their only child, Annie Party Winchester, came into the world on July 12th, 1866. Now, unfortunately, she died to an infantile disease known as marasmus, which is a severe form of malnutrition because the baby cannot metabolize protein. So she died just 40 days after birth. Now, we don't know. She was basically took her like 3 years to have this child, almost 4 years into the marriage. We don't know if she might have had other children or not other children, but other pregnancies, and she lost them. This is another thing. Contrary to a lot of the folklore that surrounds Sarah Winchester, that makes you think that she lost her daughter and then her husband followed soon after, that's not the case at all. She did not lose her husband till 15 years later. Okay? Then this is what happened. She loses her daughter in July of 1866, which, by the way, and this is another thing that, as heartbreaking as that is, especially when we view it through our modern day sentiments, back then, infantile mortality was very high. It was, unfortunately, even if you came from an upper echelon of society, you could very easily lose children. It was common to lose children, especially when they were very young, for different reasons. So this was not unheard of at all. But anyway, in 1880, Oliver Winchester, the patriarch, he dies, and he leaves the entire succession of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company to his only son, who dies a year later. William dies a year later of tuberculosis at the age of 43. Okay? Now, this is the thing. In those 15 years, again, there's no mention again of another child, of another pregnancy. So we really don't know. Was it that William maybe suffering from tuberculosis, maybe their marital life, who knows what happened? But it was a 15-year span between the death of her child and that of her husband. And despite the inference that the death of Annie and William being close together is why she left to California, is totally false. However, the loss did leave her as the widow with an inheritance of $20 million plus nearly 50% of the Winchester arm stock, which in turn earned her approximately $1,000 a day in royalties for the rest of her life, the result of which made her one of the wealthiest women in the world. Now, one of the things that she did do was she established in West Haven, Connecticut, the William Wirt Winchester Hospital, which was used to treat tuberculosis. Later on, they changed the name and it became a VA hospital many, many years later. But throughout her lifetime, even though she was living in California, she would support this hospital in West Haven, Connecticut. So, after her husband dies, contrary to, again, the folklore, she doesn't run off to California. She went on a 3-year world tour to Europe. She did not get to California until 1884. Okay, as a matter of fact, the New Haven Register put a little blurb dated 1886 that she had been removed to Europe. And strangely enough, no other information has survived to tell us exactly where she went during those years and what her activity consisted of. Which, by the way, was very unusual because most newspapers of the time, especially if you were a wealthy, part of a wealthy family, whether you were a widow or whatever, they would make mention of you being seen at this location, at this place, at this museum, or if you were visiting a certain family. There is no information about what Sarah Winchester was doing those 3 years in Europe. Now, it's believed that given her social status and her predilection towards Freemasonic tenets, and that she was also very well schooled in European languages, she could have easily been admitted to any of the permissive French Masonic lodges. And when they say Masonic, is that normally Masonic lodges would not permit female members, but apparently the French were a little bit more open-minded. So there's a suspicion that she might have been able to gain some type of entry to lodges in France. Also, another possible scenario is that she also went to visit esoteric architectural landmarks, such as the French Cathedral of Chartres, and also she had, since she held that interest in Masonic Rosicrucian, there was also an interest in labyrinths, which would have drawn her to Chartres, which has an 11th circuit labyrinth. Now, in case you're not familiar with these names, you might have heard them when it comes to anything having to do with the Knights Templar. Recently, the program Curse of Oak Island. Okay. Also, she could have found inspiration in Rosslyn Chapel. Okay, the staircase that leads to nowhere, which she reproduced later on at Winchester House. Now, in 1884, okay, she returns from Europe and takes up residence in the San Francisco Bay Area. She eventually moves inland to the Santa Clara Valley, now San Jose, and while there, she bought an 8-room farmhouse, and she named it Llanada Villa. She never called her property Winchester House. She called it Llanada Villa or Villa, and she bought the property from a Dr. Robert Caldwell. Now, again, her apparent motive for this move was to live in close proximity to her numerous Pardee relatives. And they all lived in that area from Sacramento to the Bay Area. Now, one of these Pardee relatives, now remember, this is all on her side, Enoch H. Pardee had become a highly respected physician and politician while living in Oakland. Later, his son, George C. Pardee, followed in his father's footsteps, rising to the office of Governor of California. He served there from 1903 to 1907. Now, both father and son were members of the secretive Bohemian Club, which was the offshoot of Yale's Skull and Bones Society. They were also Knights Templar Freemasons. I hope you all see where I'm going with this. Also interesting is the fact that President Theodore Roosevelt, who was also a member of the Bohemian Club, came to California in 1903 to ask Governor Pardee to run as his vice presidential candidate in the 1904 national election. The offer was turned down, and during that same trip, Roosevelt attempted to visit Sarah at the Winchester House, but again, Roosevelt's offer was turned down. Those Pardees, very secretive, weren't they? Now, she goes ahead, and after she purchases the house, which sat originally on just 161 acres. It was just farmland when she went out there. It was like a farmhouse. It was a farmhouse, and there was really nothing out there. And what she did was she hired a crew of approximately 20 carpenters, and she began the implementation of a vast building project that lasted until her death 38 years later. Now, the construction of the house was what they call an ever-building enterprise, in which rotating shifts of workers labored 24 hours per day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. In other words, there was no downtime on this. She was its only architect, and the house gradually mushroomed outwards and reached a height of 7 stories in some places, and it had about 500 to 600 rooms. Now, in 1906, the earthquake reduced the house to 4 stories, and after that, she didn't keep on building over the 4 stories like she had before. Also, it's believed that she had suffered a nervous breakdown after this event and suffered from anxiety until her death in 1922, because at one point when the earthquake happened, she was trapped in her bedroom. As a result of this, as a matter of fact, she even ordered from then on that the rooms with doors and windows would be made that where you could easily escape from them, and that the doors that could open with just the slightest pressure. Also, as an indicator of how scared she was, she bought a houseboat, and on the shores of San Francisco Bay, she had a lake dredged and an island placed in the middle. And she put the houseboat on the island and had one of her relatives living there in case another earthquake should occur. She could leave the area and go out into the ocean on the houseboat. You could tell this poor lady was, talk about PTSD from, she was trapped inside the house in her bedroom when the earthquake occurred. Now, despite being a recluse, though, she didn't hurt for living, even if she was by herself with just workers from the finer things. She dined on plates of gold and silver, which she oversaw being locked into a safe every night. And she had 13 safes installed throughout the house. And you're going to see the importance of that number 13. There was a significance to it, even though most people think of it as being an unlucky number. And part of her trying to be a recluse was that if anybody that was around her, remember this was already on 161 acres, that she felt like there was too many people moving into an area or anything, she would just buy up the land. That's what I'm saying. She started out with 161 acres and expanded, because as time went by, she would just buy more and more surrounding land. Now, aside from its immense size and Victorian-style architecture, the house had a number of unique characteristics. Now, first of all, despite when you look at it, that it looks like just like a house, it's undeniably a labyrinth. There are literally miles of maze-like corridors and twisting hallways, some of which have dead ends, forcing the traveler to turn around and back up. And if anybody knows what a labyrinth is, that's exactly what happens. If you turn down the wrong arm of it, you end up in a dead end. And if any of you are not familiar with labyrinths, I'm going to give you another example. In the Kubrick film The Shining, towards the end, when Danny and as the son and Jack Nicholson as the dad follows him out into that labyrinth. Well, it's made by a hedge, but Danny knew what to do because he had gone out there to play with his mother. Okay, and that's where Jack Nicholson's character ends up freezing outside because he doesn't know how to get out of the labyrinth, but that is what a labyrinth is. Eventually, you do get to the middle if you learn to take the correct route in there. Now, there are some centrally located passages and stairways that serve as shortcuts, allowing a virtual leap from one side of the house to the other. Traversing the labyrinth is truly dizzying and disorienting to one's sensibilities. Now, there are rooms within rooms. There's a staircase that leads nowhere, which I myself saw that firsthand. It ends in the ceiling. In another place, there's a door which opens onto a solid wall. It has about 47 chimneys in the house. They have an overhead ceiling, while in some places there are skylights covered by a roof, and some skylights are covered by another skylight. And in one place, there's a skylight built onto the floor, which I believe there's a picture of that in one of the slides. There are tiny doors leading into large spaces and large rooms that lead into very small spaces. Now, another part of the house, a second-story door opens outward to a sheer drop to the ground floor. And upside-down pillars can be found all over the entire house. Now, adding further to the mysterious features of the Winchester House, the prime numbers 7, 11, and 13 are repeatedly displayed in different ways, the most prominent being the number 13. Now, these numbers consistently show up in the number of the windows in many of the rooms, the number of stairs in the staircases, the number of rails in the railings, or the number of panels in the floors and walls, or the number of lights in the chandelier, etc. Unquestionably, these three prime numbers were extremely important to Sarah. Now, and by this, one of the things was always that she was the architect. And if you think that she just sat there and just drew something up, or that she maybe sketched something out and she maybe gave it to an architect or one of the carpenters that was there to build, and like, okay, do it since you're a builder. No, you could tell she was very precise in her numbers, even down to windows, staircase railings. There was definitely, for lack of a better word, a method to her madness. Now, one of the things also was Mrs. Winchester was really ahead of her time, and she used many of the high-tech inventions of her day. She is believed to have been one of the first builders to use wool insulation. The house was lit with carbide gas lights that was supplied by its own gas manufacturing plant. Panels of electric buttons were used to operate the lights by means of electromechanical strikers that caused the spark to ignite the various lamps. And she was also the one to make the first use of showers, elevators, two of them that are driven by hydraulics, and a third by electricity. Now, in this I saw firsthand. Besides being a house, she ran it also as a farm. It was a small town unto itself. It was virtually self-sufficient. Besides, obviously, the carpenters and the plumbers, they had an on-premise water and electrical supply and a sewage drainage system. And another thing that's really interesting, which I thought was really interesting, contrary to popular belief, the carpenters she hired were not local, but were brought in from the East under one-year contracts. These were all union carpenters that she brought over from the East Coast. Now, when she died on September 5th, 1922, her workers halted construction, leaving nails half-driven into the walls. Now, we don't know, was it because they said, okay, the lady that's paying is not paying anymore, so what for? Which I have a feeling that was probably it. In accordance with her 12-page, 13-part will, signed by her 13 times, Sarah had her entire estate divided up in generous portions to be distributed among a number of charities and those people who have faithfully spent years in her service. Her favorite niece and secretary, Marion Marriott, oversaw the removal and sale of all of her furnishings and personal property. She had a personal attorney, Roy Lieb, He was named as executor to the estate, and he was the one that sold the house. And later on, in other words, so that it could be preserved as a living museum. In other words, the instructions were by Mr. Lee to select the buyer for the property. In other words, that would allow the house to remain intact and perpetually preserved. One of the things also, I included that on there, there's, despite the Marion Marriott, I believe it was in 1960, was involved in a custody battle over her 14-year-old daughter. And they considered her father was the owner of a newspaper. One of the things there was that this girl, Margaret, was going to eventually be one of the heirs, or they assumed, of Sarah's fortune. So that even made the paper, which, believe me, was quite a scandal, because Marion had been granted a divorce based on her husband not supporting her and her daughter. So back then that was quite a scandal, especially if you were up the food chain of society. Now, so contrary to what they show in the movie, there was no male child. It was a 14-year-old daughter, an adopted daughter. Now, despite the belief that Sarah Winchester, that all she did was to instruct, in the building of each new portion of the Winchester mansion, during the time she was there, she was involved in several philanthropic efforts. Now, in 1909, this is quite interesting. She worked with her sister, Mrs. Isabel Merriman, who was a millionairess in her own right, in establishing a summer home for the poor girls from San Francisco. Okay, Mrs. Merriman was a member of the Santa Clara Juvenile Probation Commission. Apparently, she was actively involved in wayward youths. She also had more than one home in the area. In 1911, she sold a home she had at Fair Oaks near San Francisco for $200,000. You can imagine that must have been quite a house for it to be worth $200,000 back in 1911. Now, as you can tell, and this is going to reflect on what I said prior about Sarah Winchester being involved with Eastern mysticism, Freemasons, Rosicrucian. Apparently it was a family thing. It was just Sarah by herself. In 1912, her sister Isabel was reported by the local newspapers as having converted to the faith of Abdu'l-Baha, the Persian prophet, and that she had been, and I quote, commanded to go to Palestine to teach the children of the temple in the English language and the ways of the Far West. It was unknown if she went because she was already up in age by the time this happened. Now, in 1915, the local newspapers referred to Sarah as the spirit savior of the Carpenters Union. Tongue-in-cheek, everybody knew that these people were making a lot of money because of that 24/7, 365-day-a-year building project. And her sister, Isabel, who was in 1950 was age 80, was still involved with the prophet of Abdu'l-Baha and was active in the field of Persian science. So, and then again, 1916, this is when her niece was involved in that custody battle, which it seems that even the father of this child was well off. Eventually, though, amongst all in her will, she divided part of her fortune between 8 nephews and nieces. And one has to think that most of them would have been Pardee relatives of some type. Because even though she eventually goes and her body shipped back to Connecticut for burial, she lived out the last portion of her life among the Pardee relatives. Now, this is the part where we come to the folklore about Sarah Winchester. Now, despite the fact that Sarah Winchester was extremely secretive about herself, nearly all of what the public thinks it knows about her really reads like a mishmash of gossip. Now, in the old days, the tour guides were encouraged to make up stuff just to give some spice to the story. In other words, bring in the money. Again, the folklore says that after William's death in 1881, she's highly distraught and she seeks the advice of the then famous Boston medium Adam Coons. And that during a seance with Coons, she's told that because of the many people have been slain by the Winchester rifle, she's cursed by having become basically the heir of the Winchester fortune. And that supposedly Coon further instructs Sarah that the angry spirits demand that she moves to California and build them a house. The story supposedly goes on that upon her arrival in California, she starts to hold her own seances every midnight so she could receive the next day's building instructions from the spirits. And her seances allegedly involved the use of a Ouija board and planchette, and that 13 various robes of different colors she would ritualistic wear each night within the confines of her quote-unquote seance room. Now, part of also what the spirits demanded from her, in other words, to appease them, she made sure that the construction of the house went on nonstop 24/7, 365 days a year, because she had been told that the day that the building stopped, she would die. Now, for some inexplicable reason, however, Mrs. Winchester took precautions in the building's design in order to incorporate all the strange features of the house to confuse the evil spirits, and that she would bring her alarm bell every night at midnight to signal the spirits that it was seance time, and then again at 2 a.m. signaling the spirits that it was time to depart. Which begs the question, who was in charge of whom? And why would spirits have an inability or need to keep track of time? Now, again, if you think about it, if she's receiving her instructions from these seances with all these different angry spirits, why would she take the pains to repeatedly infuse the number 7 and 11 into the architecture, and the number 13 as well? Especially as everyone knows that it supposedly is an unlucky number. And there was also the story that she would sleep in a different room every night as an extra measure to throw the spirits off her trail. So, no wonder that when you mention her name, most people think of her as that crazy lady who built that weird house because she was afraid that the ghosts were going to get her or kill her or something like that. And if they've never been to the house, usually they just saw some show on TV. Now, unfortunately, the misinformation is made worse because of the haunted house tour business. And let's face it, the Winchester Mystery House is a commercial enterprise which profits by perpetuating this myth. They give her a fair spin. They show Mrs. Winchester in a very positive light. However, they have a lot of tours and booklets and postcards and all this other merchandise in their souvenir shop with the title "The Mansion Designed by Spirits," which only enhances this version of Sarah Winchester's life. But I don't think. I think that there was something much deeper going on. As a matter of fact, much more esoteric and metaphysical than just some distraught widow trying to make amends with spirits because her family had produced a firearm. Now, dispelling the myth was that if you look at what she did during those 38 years that she lived in this house, she deliberately went to great lengths to leave a well-designed trail of clues and artifacts to follow. Okay? And it becomes a matter of separating fact from fiction. All right. let's first start off with the allegations about Sarah and the medium Adam Koontz. Now, as you know, around this time is also when spiritualism had taken off in the United States. The Fox sisters, this was after the Civil War. Many people had lost loved ones, so there was a wanting, a desire to communicate with the other side. And there was some authentic mediums. There was also a lot of charlatans, etc. But it seems that there is no record of evidence that Mrs. Winchester ever met, much less had a reading with Adam Koontz. There's no evidence to support the idea that she was even a spiritualist or had any inclination to believe in communication with the dead. Moreover, there's absolutely no factual basis to support the idea that Sarah ever used the so-called seance room for the purpose of conducting seances. Her closest companion and nurse of many years, Henrietta Sievers, firmly denied that Mrs. Winchester had any spiritualist leanings. Furthermore, why would all these odd features that she built into a house to confuse evil spirits? It's almost like, in other words, the only way that they could explain why she built all these anomalies and odd things into her house, it had to be because, in other words, that it was related to the spirit world. And also, if she truly believed that she was cursed by the Winchester fortune, why would she just make it worse by continuing to own vast shares of stock in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, and then later acquire still greater controlling shares that she maintained and profited from for the rest of her life? Definitely, the folklore is entertainment, but it's a complete fabrication. And really, the only thing you have to ask yourself is, why did she build the house the way she did? And then there's another thing that's really important. The Moors of that time, weapons were not seen the way a lot of people see them nowadays. They were a fact of life. People used them for self-defense. There was no sentimentality as far as there was something evil. As a matter of fact, back then, a lot of people saw firearms, not only the Winchester, but all firearms, as a way to either protect or feed yourself. So you could see where that whole curse and angry spirits because they had been killed by the Winchester was something that was fabricated much later on into the 20th century. Now, as noted earlier, when Sarah was very young, and when she was first exposed to Masonic and Rosicrucian and Baconian concepts, this is where she got that idea or that concept of labyrinths, and which she incorporated into designing the house. Now, the ancient mystery schools emphasize the tradition of what they call the initiate or the novice student. Okay? And this is where this candidate has to undergo like a series of tests in order to prove that they're ready and worthy to go on to the next step or the higher levels of learning, and that these are called degrees. And you can even see that even now with the Freemasons, you ascend by degrees. Now, in ancient times, the initiate was subjected to a test called the labyrinth. And this labyrinth was usually placed underground, or it was like in an enclosed structure, mostly consisting of dark, winding stairs and passageways. And this initiate had to find the correct path through the labyrinth, going through numerous pitfalls, obstacles, and traps. The purpose of this test was to make this person or this candidate develop and hone their powers of intuition and insight. And I want to stop a second, because you see this now, even just to get you an idea. If you look at the Star Wars movies, okay, when Luke Skywalker goes to meet with Yoda to train under Master Yoda, what is it that Yoda's telling him? Okay, trust your intuition, Luke. Close your eyes, Luke. This is along the same lines. I'm just trying to make an analogy in modern times as to really sometimes what are the roots of some of the things that we see in modern movies and stories. When in reality, the roots of these things sometimes go to secret societies and cults from way, way back. Also, when she met her husband, William, that's another thing that's very strong in this tradition, is what they call numerology. Where they add up the letters of the names to add up to certain numbers. Something called the Pythagorean cipher. And that all of these things have meanings. And that you might, for example, use certain names if they give a certain addition. In other words, that their bottom line is a certain number. For example, the number 777 is extremely important to Kabbalists, Rosicrucians, and Freemasons. All right. For example, and when you look at William's full name, William Wirt Winchester, okay, it ended up being something that was very, very close for them. And his initials of WWW equate to 555, which is another crucial Kabbalistic Masonic number. The 21s or the 3 sevens, remember 3 times 7 is 21, is a consistent theme that you see in all the names in the Winchester family. Now, the reason we know that Sarah adopted Bacon's numerological methodology stands on the evidence that she left behind a testimony to her thoughts and intentions. For example, she definitely thought of the number 52 as the code number representing the name Winchester. She had 52 skylights in her house. Her earthly remains, along with those of William and Annie, are interred in plot number 52 of New Haven's Evergreen Cemetery. And just to be sure that we would understand the connection between the number 52 and the name Winchester, which are not accidental, she deliberately placed coded inscriptions on the 3 tombstones of the Winchester family plot. They read Baby Ann, SLW, and WWW. These 3 inscriptions add up to the Pythagorean cipher to 52. And one of the slides you see, I'm showing not once but twice their tombstone. Now, in addition to the number 111 or 111, she adopted the Kabbalistic number 777 as a code number representing the name William Wirt Winchester. We know this because in the decade following William's death, she maintained precisely 777 shares of stock in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. These are not coincidences. And we know that this and other numbers had special significance for Sarah Winchester. In other words, even before she started to build the Winchester House, she was already weaving a tapestry of numbers into other things in her life or other relationships, things that she had going even before she was there. Now, there was also part of this mindset is that architecture, that in other words, that there's a sacred geometry that we see also in architecture. And again, we go back to all these places where, again, I'm going to use the Da Vinci Code as a movie, as a reference, where they run all over Europe. And some of the examples or the hints or the clues, if you want to, are works of art, but mostly they're incorporated into architecture. Okay, and as far back as there's a Roman architect and philosopher named Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, and he was the first one that made the connection of the value of the mathematical value of pi. Okay, which is divine proportion, golden ratio, etc. Then later on in the 13th century, the Italian mathematician Leonardo Fibonacci translated into real numbers. And many of you might have heard of the Fibonacci Sequence. All right. And it's a rational system of numbers. And basically, this is part of arcane knowledge and how it relates to architecture. Now, this information or this knowledge was adopted and guarded by the Knights Templar. And all it did was that they just went underground after their downfall in 1307. And they reemerged as the invisible college of the Rosicrucian movement. In other words, these were already thoughts, ways of thinking that just went underground and reemerged with a different name, but the bases were still the same. The beliefs were still the same. Okay. Now, just so you'll know, the all these having to do with, just to give you an example of the Fibonacci sequence, as far as even though it's considered ancient history, you can find the Fibonacci sequence. You can find it in the proportions within the human body and of animals, plants, your own DNA, the solar system, music, art, religious texts, ancient artifacts, and architecture. In other words, if you look, this sequence is found throughout living and inanimate objects or creations. Now, in their book, The Templar Revelation, authors Lynn Pickett and Clive Prince point out the rather obscure fact that the Rosicrucian movement was the cause of the Renaissance. Okay, this was the time of the golden age of genius. This is at that time, mostly in Europe, they had gone through what was called the Dark Ages. And when the Renaissance spawned, this is when great works of art were made, music, science, etc. And one of the most influential minds that came out of the Renaissance was Francis Bacon. And he's thought of as single-handedly inspiring the English Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment that would follow after the Renaissance. And he was the one that gave the Rosicrucian movement its name and put into words what its purpose was. And he created a new branch of the Rosicrucian order called Speculative Freemasonry. Now, among his new and very revolutionary innovations in the arts and sciences, most of them which were founded on this type of ancient wisdom, as with the Templars, such knowledge was to be preserved and propagated through the tradition of the initiate, which she explained to you, which is where you start and you have to basically pass tests to go on to the next level. Now, Bacon's philosophy adhered to the belief of the ancient mystery schools, such as architecture as art, higher dimensional unification, and very importantly, the theme of concealment. His concept of concealment originated with his view of Proverbs 25 in the Old Testament. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. This is the underlying principle that evolved into both the modern scientific method and the Masonic Hierarchic legend. Moreover, Bacon applied the theme of concealment to everything he touched, including his own life, which is true of Sarah Winchester. And this is where you see that in later life, she was basically carrying out what she had learned as a young girl when she was being sent to school, and also by the adults that surrounded her. Now, if you look at Sarah's puzzle, because basically when you look at that house, it was not only the house, it was her life that later on became a puzzle, was that she understood, along with Francis Bacon, that the only way to reveal everything about nature is to conceal it through the science of numbers. And despite what everybody thinks, that when she lost her daughter and her husband, that she went off and through fear of dying, she went off and just put together this house and just kept building. That's not really it. Where she was basically concealing all these different messages with numbers and things within the architecture. In other words, like Rosslyn Chapel, the Winchester House serves as a higher dimensional puzzle. And all you have to do is just follow the path. But you have to know what you're looking for also. And that's why she crafted all these different Masonic and Rosicrucian features into the structure, like these clues within the labyrinth. And the way she thought of it, again, is based on Masonic and Rosicrucians, of that you have to pass this test in order to go to the next, or to the next degree. Now, first of all, when you get to the front of the house, like Solomon's temple, it faces true east. Okay, now this is symbolically important, as the east represents the source of light, or what's light being knowledge and wisdom. Moreover, like a Masonic lodge, the house is emblematic of Solomon's temple. Mrs. Winchester regarded everyone who stepped onto her property as a prospective initiate. So, naturally, the initiate's journey begins at the front wrought iron gates, and each gate is decorated with a sun symbol, which I can attest to firsthand is accurate. Now, she also inserted daisies into the center of two of the sun symbols on the front wrought iron gates. And this is important because the daisy represents the two essential qualities of the initiate, one being innocence, the other being fidelity. Also, the sun is a symbol or the insignia of the senior deacon of a Masonic lodge. It's the senior deacon who acts as the initiate's guide throughout their initiation in all the Blue Lodge degrees. In other words, by passing through Sarah's gates, the initiate becomes his own guide and pursues the path of self-initiation. I'm sure that 99.9% of those who came, remember, she was a recluse. She really didn't allow that many people to come to the house to begin with. Very few realized that they were entering into a rite of self-initiation. Now, once inside the gates, if you look straight ahead and you view the front of the house through the frame of the two palm trees that represent the twin porch pillars known as Boaz and Jachin at the entrance of Solomon's temple, for all Masonic initiates or the candidates, these are the first features they will pass through when entering the lodge room. Now, after they pass through the pillars, they symbolically ascend a winding staircase leading into the temple. Now, instead of allowing the admittance in the front of her house, Mrs. Winchester required people to enter from the rear through one entrance strategically located near the northwest corner. Her reason for this has to do with the fact that all Masonic initiates must enter the lodge room through its northwest corner. The entrance, referred to by the tour guides as the Switchback Staircase, is built so as to wind from the center outward, round and round, in the shape of an Archimedes spiral until it reaches the second floor. It has 44 tiny steps, and each step is just under 2 inches in height. So the effect is more like walking up a ramp than climbing a set of stairs. And in this recent movie that just came out, which I saw, I was there at the premiere of it, it shows those stairs, but her secretary explains to the character there, the doctor that was there trying to assess her mental state, that she had built it this way supposedly because of her arthritis or whatever. As you can tell, that's not really what it was about. Now, the staircase has 7 turns, and this is where she blends symbolism of the winding staircase of the second Masonic degree with the symbolism of Jacob's ladder. Now, according to Kabbalistic and Masonic tradition, Jacob's ladder is a ramp that winds around 7 turns, ascending up into heaven. Now, the most important or the most crucial room in which Sarah wanted to initiate to begin their journey of discovery is in the ballroom. This is the only room in the house which was constructed almost entirely without nails. And this is really important because this mimics the building of Solomon's temple. If you enter the ballroom, you're going to notice it's got a beautiful parquet floor with light and dark squares that bear striking resemblance to the checkered mosaic floors of Masonic lodge rooms. If you go further into the room, you also notice 2 elongated stained glass windows which flank both sides of the room's fireplaces. These 2 glass windows were designs that were used by Francis Bacon, including something as a winding banner. With the exception of what the inscriptions say on the banners, they are exact mirror images of each other. And there's even a thought that Sarah not only identified with Bacon, but in all probability saw herself as a Bacon reincarnated. Because she, apparently, her wealth of detail leads one to believe that there was something there for her. Now, and all the use of all her codes throughout the house. There was also reference to, among the Bacon Shakespearean context, something about Cressida, which is part of one of Shakespeare's works. And a lot of people think that Sarah is alluding to the young maiden's flirtatious nature. And in fact, the traditional Orthodox scholastic view of Cressida is that she's a whore. But that is not the point that Bacon, writing as Shakespeare, was trying to make. Nor was it the point that Sarah was trying to make. The deeper truth about Cressida is that she does whatever she must in order to survive. And Sarah, in her own way, saw herself as a survivor. And there's also another reference to Richard II, which she also, Sarah, identified with, which was seen as an imprisoned and lonely king. However, she identified with Richard's resolve to overcome their plight. In other words, when you look at that, she saw herself as a survivor. In other words, doing whatever it took to survive. And even though it was self-imprisonment and being lonely, she decides that she's going to overcome. Also, there's reference, which was part of all of this, how would you call it, mysticism that was going on during the Elizabethan times, which is something that John Dee's secret signature was an elongated number 7 with 2 circles under it, representing his 007 identity. And this is the basis for a hieroglyphical pun in the form of a cane flanked by 2 pawls, representing Tubal Cain. Now, throughout the centuries, the Tubal Cain symbol was employed either as a cane shaped like a backward 7 or cane with a simple crooked hand. And she uses this symbolism in different places. Now, normally this symbol generates controversy because of its phallic connotation. And which, despite everything, she was a creature of her time, so she found the symbol too risque for use. So what she basically did was she devised a new symbol representing Tubal Cain in the form of the letter C with 2 balls. And if she even went on, and you can see that again throughout different windows and different things in the house. Now, Sarah's bedroom is located on the south side of the 2nd story. The ceiling is a perfectly square grid consisting of 49, in other words, 7 squared individual squares. That is reminiscent of a mathematical table devised by John Dee. The bedroom faces south, or the window faces south, and it overlooks a beautiful garden and lawn. And in the middle of the lawn, we see a magnificent crescent-shaped hedge accentuated with brilliant yellow chrysanthemums. And I will tell you personally, when I was there, and that was one of the things, besides, I didn't capture the depth of all these things I'm describing, but there was a lot of things that I saw. And when I saw that crescent moon out the garden, I was thinking to myself, there's more to this than some spiritualism thing with the 13 and the crescent. That's really when I got the first clue, which I confirmed with some of the research that I did with her, which makes perfect sense. Now, the significance of having this crescent with yellow chrysanthemums had to do with her paying homage to Francis Bacon, because this was something that he had on his own coat of arms, and also the crescent emphasizes the moon's relationship to the number 13, because it's a lunar number, because there's 13 full moons in a year. And that's why the Mayan and the Chinese that had 13-month calendars were more accurate than the Gregorian 12-month, which is what we use now. Now, she also covered the walls of her bedroom with a special wallpaper displaying the triquetra symbols. According to Celtic tradition, the triquetra represents the three lunar goddesses, who in turn represent the three phases of the moon. Now, she also wanted to underscore the relationship between the moon's reflective light and the astral light, also known as Akashic records. And here she's giving or pointing to her belief in Theosophy. Now, in the middle, in the exact center of the house, is when you get to what is called the seance room. Now, remember, this is where supposedly she would go at midnight to conduct these seances so that she could get receive the building instructions from the spirits. The thing is that in truth, all Rosicrucians have a room or a space in the center of their homes. And this serves the purpose of being far from the distraction of outside noises, and it's usually called a sanctum. And the Freemasons refer to it as a chamber of reflection. The sanctum is where the Rosicrucians go to study, meditate, and perform private ritual. Now, this Sarah's sanctum is shaped like a cube, and the room measures 11 feet by 11 feet by 11 feet. Now, originally, she had it painted entirely blue, and this is important because it mimics the Masonic concept of the canopy of heaven or heavenly arc, which is widely featured as part of decor in Masonic lodges and the Masonic lodge rooms. And she had 13 pegs installed in one of the sanctum walls, and each peg held a different colored robe, consistent with the Rosicrucian practice of wearing different colored robes for each lunar month. Now, on the ground floor, not far from the Jacob's Ladder, there is an unfinished room which Sarah planned to use as a second ballroom. Now, when you enter the room, you notice through a rough horizontal crossbeam extending across the upper portion of the south wall. Now, to the untrained eye, the beam just looks like another piece of wood. To a Freemason, they would recognize it, or recognize its resemblance to the 24-inch gauge of the Masonic first degree. In another part of the house, you come to a landing connecting two staircases, each leading to a different second-story room. The staircase to the left has 7 stairs, while the one on the right has 11 stairs. This feature is referred to as the 711 staircase. Now, another important aspect of the 711 staircase is that it forms a large letter Y, which symbolizes a fork in the road. Again, when you look at it from the point of being an initiate, trying to overcome obstacles, this is where the candidate must make a choice between traveling the easier left path or climb the more difficult right path. Naturally, the right path is a correct one. Now, if you go through these stairs from the second floor left to right, he would be traveling from west to east. In all Masonic lodges, one is always regarded as to be traveling from west towards the source of light in the east. Now, as you can see, and this just only touches on part of the numerology that's woven into, for lack of a better word, the fabric, in this sense, the building of this house. She also was looking at what they call the concept of a fourth dimension. That is becoming even more apparent lately with a lot of discoveries in physics that started, but that their roots started like in the late 19th century. In other words, that back then is when some of the artists and intellectuals started thinking about the dynamics of higher dimensionals, how that higher dimensional spaces might work. Now, just to give you an idea, there was an English mathematician by the name of Charles Dodgson, and he wrote under the pseudonym of Lewis Carroll. And he wrote a children's book that described the mind-boggling properties that you would encounter in a fourth spatial dimension. And this book was titled Through the Looking Glass. And it considers the glass or the mirror as a portal to higher dimensions. That was a belief system around since Dee and Bacon's time. Now, in Lewis Carroll's Wonderland, everything seems to defy common sense. In other words, a distinction between large and small dissolves, and time speeds up, slows down, or then stands still. And a lot of the concepts that are seen in the Looking Glass, or the story of the Looking Glass, are the hallmarks of Einstein's theory of relativity. And it almost seems like at some point Sarah seems to borrow some of the pages of Lewis Carroll when she uses large doors that lead into small spaces and small doors that open up into ridiculously large space. Now, this idea, or these ideals of what of the higher dimensions, introduces into something called super mechanics. In other words, that they don't they transcend what we think of as length, width, and height. And it's almost like way beyond what we think of as a two-dimensional space, because if you look at things through two dimensions, you can't see certain aspects that allow you to see it in three dimension, and so on and so forth, because of your perception. At the time that Sarah was going through her, I don't think it was an epiphany, but I think it was something that she had already acquired early in life. Artists such as George Braque and Pablo Picasso were painting stunning images depicting fourth dimensional worldview, and that they appropriately called it Cubism. But ultimately for her, it was in her number, which again were the predominant ones were 7, 11, and 13, or multiples of that. In other words, that they would be simplified down to those numbers. And we could think of them as the Winchester numbers. She went on, and like I said, she incorporated not only into the house even the name that she gave her daughter when she was marrying her husband. She got like the thumbs up, the green light, because of what she saw as the numerology of his name, including her own once she took on the surname of Winchester. When you look at her, just to give you an example, when you look at the wrought iron gates in the front of the house, there's 2 8-petal daisies, and she has daisies everywhere in and around the house. and they're carved into wood fixtures, and they appear most in the stained glass windows. Now, many of these species of daisy flowers can be found also in many of the gardens around the house. Now, the daisy was very special to Sarah for two reasons. Again, first, it symbolized the initiate, and secondly, it's one of nature's finest examples of the hidden unifying symmetry of the number 13. Many species of the daisy have 13 petals. Moreover, daisy species have 13 branches growing out of their stalks when they mature, and the head of every daisy flower forms a Fibonacci spiral consisting of 34 tiny florets spiraling clockwise inward from the outer ring to the center, and 21 florets spiraling outward counterclockwise from the center to the outer ring. The invisible difference is 13. Another thing, just to give you an idea of how encompassing, not only within location, but of time, that these concepts have existed, Stonehenge is built precisely on the spot where 13 describes the hypotenuse of a triangle, the sides being 5 and 12, with the base at the Bluestone in Wales and at Lundy Island, the Bristol Channel. In other words, these prehistoric sites that we have all over the world adhered to some version of these measurements or numbers. In other words, and I'm sure you've even seen it in a lot of shows, that a lot of people think it's extraordinary that Stone Age people would be able to build such a sophisticated clock like Stonehenge, and to locate it at precisely 13 units from the Bluestone origin in Wales. And the continuation of this line crosses precisely at the location of the Great Pyramid at Giza, which had not yet been constructed at the time of the completion of Stonehenge. How did the builders, whether it was of Stonehenge of Giza, know where it was precisely that they should start building these edifices? Now, like I said, you're going to see Sarah always displays 8-petaled daisies in pairs. There are no true species of the daisy family having as few as 8 petals. And it's apparent that what she does is that this version of the 8-petaled daisy was her way of emphasizing the Fibonacci relationship between the numbers 13 and 8. You're also going to see another thing called the spider web window. Inside the house, there's 13 bathrooms. The 13 bathrooms have 13 steps leading up to the entrance. The exterior wall around the entrance has 13 wood panels. Inside, we find 6 identical windows, all fashioned in a unique spider web design. Although there are other spider web windows located in other parts of the house, this is the final place where Sarah clearly wanted the enlightened initiate to land. And in other words, this to her was part of, or exemplified, the symmetric structure of the universe. This is her understanding of the universe. She was trying to boil it down and put it into a house. Something in what they call the spiderweb symmetry in the grand unified theory. Now, as you can, and I'm sure many people have seen a lot of the shows that show where the backside of the US $1 bill has all these Masonic codes and symbolism. And the bill's design incorporates an extensive spiderweb structure which serves as a framework encompassing all the different components in the overall pattern. Like, in other words, the pyramid with its hovering capstone and the all-seeing eye representing the unfinished work of the quest to mirror the divine blueprint, which is in accordance with Proverbs 25. And part of it, and the reason is that she understood that all the unfinished work, that she knew she would not be able to achieve it in her lifetime. However, had stated earlier, she also wanted to make sure that this house was going to be left intact. In other words, her puzzle was still going to be left intact or preserved, as she left it almost as a testament to her intent that someone would eventually arrive to pick up her torch. Did she foresee where somebody was going to be reincarnated as her, embodied as her, the same way she thought maybe she followed Bacon? And of course, the answers in the numbers. Now, the question is, who's going to complete the puzzle? Now, as far as the numbers, when Sarah died in September of 1922, her bank account or her fortune had dwindled to $4 million, which, by the way, back then, that was still quite a lot of money. It still is, and it was back then especially. But, in other words, between her building of this house and her charitable works, her $20 million plus all the other money she was making had dwindled and come down to only $4 million. And she died in September, and by December, within 3 months, the house sold for $135,000. It was estimated at that time that she had spent about $3 million or more in building and tearing it down and redoing it. Then in January of 1923, I believe it was bought and resold. I think it was for it to go into certain hands. January of 1923, it sold at auction for $5,000. And by July 1st of 1923, this was less than a year after she had died, it was opened as the Mystery House. And this is when tours were being given of the entire house. And it was described as having 240 rooms, each laid out in suites of 8 rooms with secret panels connecting them. Now, it's really weird because another thing that was of note, and again, we don't know how accurate this is, during these last years that she was alive, there were some newspapers that noted that her servants were Hindu and that she practiced rituals related to a strange religious cult, not spiritualism. And this flies in direct contrast to the stories that we had heard about Sarah being an ardent spiritualist and so on and so forth. So it almost makes you think that despite her efforts to be very private and to only deal with her family members or with certain people, maybe the word got out somehow as to really what she was dabbling in or who was there in the house. Now, in 1937, a Mr. and Mrs. John Brown had been the custodians since 1923. They had moved into the turret room of the house, and they were there all the time. Now, in 1937, magically, the 13th year after they start working there, a newspaper article is written how they say that throughout the years, they had turned out several requests to hold seances in the house, and that in the 13th year of being custodians, they started to hear footsteps in the dark after living all this time and not hearing everything. And Mr. Brown says he would go to investigate and he would never find anything, as well as that he found that the front door was being unlatched from the inside. They also said that people that would be touring the house would claim to hear conversations from other rooms in the house which were empty. I personally think that this was the first time that stories of hauntings and ghosts or misleading information was being given out to attract more visitors. Okay, now these are some of the ghostly stories associated with the Winchester House. The first one is the case of the ghostly handyman. Some of her loyal workmen and house servants may still be looking after the place, according to sightings of figures or the feelings of presence reported many times over the years by tour guides and visitors alike. One frequent apparition is a man with jet black hair believed to have been a former handyman. He's been seen repairing the fireplace in the ballroom or pushing an equally special wheelbarrow. A wheelbarrows indeed linger in the beyond down a long dark hallway. I remember seeing one of the various shows that came out throughout the years about the Winchester House, and I believe they interviewed one of the long-time, I guess, maintenance man, and him and his son, actually, they say they saw this. And of all the stories that I think of any ghosts, I would tend to believe that probably the most possible one would be that of somebody that had worked there for a long time, and still be seen. I have all the possibilities of a ghost or somebody that became attached to living there. I would think this would be the most probable one, would be a handyman or a carpenter, somebody that worked there. Now, the other sightings is the secret of the invisible hand, and the story on that goes is that several years ago, a man working on one of the many restoration projects in the mansion started his day early in a section with several fireplaces known as the Hall of Fires. Now, the house was really, really quiet right before the tours got underway, and he was working up on a ladder when he felt someone tap him on the back. He turned to ask what the person wanted. No one was there. He thought he had just imagined it, so he goes back to work only to experience what felt like someone pushing against his back. That was enough. He hurried down the ladder, crossed the estate, and started another project, figuring that someone or something didn't want him working in the Hall of Fires that day. Again, that's very possible. This one, I don't know. It's the sign of the heavy sigh. The story goes that there's a tour guide who was leading visitors to the room, or the Daisy bedroom, which is the room where Sarah Winchester was trapped during the 1906 quake. And just when she was about to start talking in that room, she hears a very clear sigh come from the small hallway outside the bedroom door. And she thinks it's one of her guests that's fallen behind. And she calls to the person, but then she doesn't see anyone. And as her eyes adjust to the darkness of the hallway, she does see something. And she says she described it as a form of a small dark person slowly emerging and then gliding around the corner. She once goes around the corner and again saw nothing but heard another sigh. And she's thinking that this was a form of Sarah Winchester, upset that people were in her favorite bedroom. That one, I don't know. Somehow or other, I tend to believe that, again, of any experiences of spirits or hauntings would probably be tied into people that did a lot of work there. So again, guys, I hope you like this show. I thought that it was appropriate, like I said, because I've been there quite a few years back, but because of the movie and everything. And again, this goes to show that a lot of the information that's put out there sometimes by Hollywood or just stuff that's made up along the way sometimes has very, very little to do with the reality of what occurred there. And to me personally, I think this is so much more interesting than some crazy lady who was fearing the curse of her gun company and trying to stay from angry ghosts killing her. This to me is so much more interesting because this lady was doing something that, if you look at it, stretches back hundreds of years into very arcane, metaphysical, unusual knowledge that, I mean, if you're one for secrets, then definitely you would be in good company with Sarah Winchester. So guys, take care. Thank you so much for being part of my audience.